Hey everyone, so if you're running a Proxmox Homelab, especially on regular consumer SSDs, you've probably had that sinking feeling, watching your drive's health just tick down way faster than you thought it would. Well, today we're going to dive right into that problem and talk about some really smart strategies from the community to stop that premature wear and tear in its tracks.
So let me just ask you straight up. Does it feel like your solid-state drives are just burning out? Lasting for months instead of years? Like they're aging in dog years? Yeah, if that sounds familiar, you are definitely in the right place.
And listen, you're not going crazy, you're not imagining things. This is a super common issue and it catches a ton of home labbers off guard. In fact, this whole thing came up because of a user with one of those little Lenovo M720Q mini PCs who was staring down this exact problem.
And this really just puts it all into perspective. Just 6 months. That's all it took for their mirrored drives, regular consumer drives, to start showing some seriously worrying signs of wear. So there they were, stuck with not enough space, a tight budget, and a clock that was ticking really fast. The big question is, what can you actually do about it?
Okay, so the very first step, and this is before you even think about buying new hardware, is to figure out what's really going on under the hood. You've got to become a bit of a detective and investigate the crime scene.
I love this question from the community because it's just so perfect. It gets right to the point. What is causing all this chaos? What's behind all this crazy write activity? Is it your VMs? Is it the containers? Or is it something a little more sneaky?
And here they are, the usual suspects. Excessive logging is a huge one. ZFS, as awesome as it is, can be really write-heavy. Then you've got the constant churn from temp files, swap activity from your VMs and containers, or even system services you forgot you were even running. All these tiny little writes, they add up so fast.
And if you want to know just how bad this hidden problem can be, get this. One user found their system, which seemed totally idle, was writing over 660 megabytes of data every single hour. That's almost 16 gigabytes a day of basically nothing, just background noise.
So, here's the kicker. This isn't a problem that only happens on some super complex, heavily tweaked setup. Nope, even a default, fresh-out-of-the-box Proxmox install can be surprisingly chatty. Chatty enough to cause some serious wear if you're not paying attention.
Okay, so now that we've kind of identified the bad guys, let's talk solutions. And we're going to start with the easy wins. These are simple changes anybody can make that can have a huge impact on how long your SSDs last. Now, this first one might sound a little counterintuitive, but honestly, one of the best things you can do is just buy a bigger drive. See, an SSD works by spreading out all the write operations across all of its tiny memory cells, trying to wear them out evenly. A bigger drive simply has way more cells, which means each individual cell gets written to a lot less often.
And that's really the key takeaway here. More space literally means more endurance. So grabbing a 2 terabyte consumer drive instead of a 512 gig one can dramatically, and I mean dramatically, extend its life, even if you're doing the exact same work. In this world, size really is endurance.
All right, here's another brilliant tip from the community. Let's say you have 2 different kinds of drives, like a super fast NVMe and a slower SATA SSD. You might think, hey, I'll mirror them for redundancy. But that's usually a bad idea. Why? Well, 2 reasons. First, your performance gets dragged down to the speed of the slowest drive. And second, every single write gets duplicated, which means you're wearing out both drives twice as fast. The much smarter play is to split their roles. Use that fast NVMe for your power-hungry VMs and use the SATA drive for things like backups or less important containers.
Okay, we've nailed the easy wins. Now, let's roll up our sleeves and get into the more advanced stuff. If you're comfortable getting your hands dirty on the command line, there are some really powerful tweaks you can make to seriously slash that write activity, especially if you're a ZFS user.
But first, we got to understand this term, write amplification. It's this weird phenomenon where the amount of data that's physically written to your SSD is actually a multiple of the data you thought you were writing, and file systems like ZFS, as great as they are, can sometimes be a big cause of this. It basically multiplies your wear and tear problem. So a really popular tool to fight this is called log2bram. The idea is pretty simple. It takes all those noisy, constant system logs and redirects them to a temporary spot in your computer's RAM. Then it only writes them down to the actual SSD every so often. Now, you got to be careful here. You have to tune it just right, because if that little RAM disk fills up, it could crash your services.
And for the true ZFS power users out there, here's a very specific setting you can tune. ZFS_TXG_timeout. Okay, so by default, ZFS commits its data to your disk every 5 seconds. By changing that number to something like 180 seconds or even more, you're basically telling it, hey, hold on, batch up those writes into bigger, less frequent chunks, and that is so much kinder to your SSD. But there's a pretty big catch.
And yeah, this is a big one. When you delay writes like that, it means if your server suddenly loses power, poof, you could lose up to 3 minutes of data that was just sitting there in memory waiting to be written. So here's the deal, and this is crucial. Do not even think about making this change unless your server is plugged into a UPS, an uninterruptible power supply. Seriously.
All right, let's zoom out a little bit from all the technical stuff and talk about mindset, about philosophy. Because, sometimes the best fix isn't about the hardware or a command line tweak, it's about adopting a smarter overall strategy.
This quote from the community forum just hits the nail on the head. Backups are more important than a mirror. It's so true. We get so obsessed with things like RAID mirrors to protect us from a drive dying, but is that really the biggest threat we face? I mean, look at the difference here. A mirror protects you from exactly one thing, a single drive failing. That's it. A good backup strategy, though, that protects you from a drive failure, plus accidentally deleting that critical file, a system update that goes horribly wrong, or even something catastrophic like a ransomware attack. It's not even a fair fight.
And here's one last hardware tip that fits this whole smarter, not harder idea. Take a look at the used enterprise SSD market. You can often find these incredibly durable data center drives on places like eBay for way, way less than they cost new. The only real catch is you have to double check that the physical form factor, the M2 key or the length, is actually compatible with your machine.
So, we've gone through all these different tips. From plain detective to advanced ZFS tuning, what's the big picture here? What's the main thing we should all take away from this?
The one theme that ties all this together is this. Awareness is so much more powerful than just throwing expensive gear at the problem. It's about knowing what your system is actually doing, figuring out what's constantly writing to your disks, and then making smart choices to optimize all of that. A little bit of smart configuration can literally buy you years of extra drive life.
And so, I'll leave you with this final thought. It's pretty clear you don't need to spend a fortune on enterprise-grade hardware to run a solid Homelab. But the real question is, do you have a strategy? Are you thinking about where your data lives, how often it's being written, and most importantly, how it's being protected? Because that is what really matters in the end.